the very basis of our service, the sort of core values, if you apply them in your real life, what can go wrong? Genuinely, like, what a fantastic grounding. Simon Sinek talks about start with why. If you know, and if you know your why, you can overcome any how. That is the basis of our military family, our military experience, and I think that's an incredible message to take out into any sphere, but particularly politics.
It is an absolute delight to be here at the Honourable Artillery Company with the Business Club and Business Network. And tonight is a special episode in front of an audience, a packed room of the club here at the HAC. And I'm really honoured to be joined this evening by two very good friends of mine, James Clark and Ed from the Conservative Friends of the Armed Forces, both veterans of the regular army, and James is still serving the Army Reserves. Ed, I don't think you are. No, yeah.
Cut the apron strings.
Sacked it. But they both have a phenomenal record of service in Afghanistan, and also took that brave step of going into politics, having left the regular armed forces. So before we get into this evening, and we explore their military and their political journeys, how did you two meet?
I've told this story before, but I think you should tell it.
It was quite romantic, really.
Yeah.
So
candlelight.
Yeah, exactly.
Over candlelight, actually.
So I stood as a parliamentary candidate against Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 for the Conservative Party, something of a hospital pass. And no, I didn't win. I tried to galvanise as many local volunteers as I could. I called in a few favours. Those of you who are sad enough to go onto my website, you can actually see some of the photographs, and there are some of my peer group platoon commanders who came out to deliver leaflets in Islington to try and help me with that, which I'm very grateful for. After the campaign had finished, I received, I think, an email from a LinkedIn request from a plucky, enthusiastic Irishman who said, "Hey, I saw that you just got smashed by Jeremy Corbyn. I'd love a piece of that too. How do I get involved?" It wasn't quite as casual as that, but Ed basically said, "Look, I'm interested in politics. I've got a military background. You seem like an all right bloke." Which is probably one of the key elements of how we ended up connecting. And then I said to Ed, do you want to go for a drink in a pub in Islington? So we met up and
I suggested a pub, and he said, definitely not that pub.
Because I'd probably been there before.
Yeah. Ed, is that your take on the evening?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. You're being quite humble though about you've given me a piece of advice that evening, which I've mentioned on your podcast before, Jonny.
It was don't do it.
If anyone wants to go back to season 4, episode 6, that's my episode on the podcast. But you gave me a really good bit of advice. So anyone here is interested in politics or getting involved with politics, one, followed all of Jonny's work because he does superb work with Campaign Force. But the second bit of advice that James gave me was, it seems a bit trite to say, but it's just get stuck in, basically. And I came away from that and did exactly that, and then within about 6 months I was the deputy in the association, and then within about 12 months I was the chairman, and then this plucky candidate came to me a couple of months later and said, you know what, I really want to fight Jeremy Corbyn again in Islington. And that's how James and I, continued our friendship, and we've become quite good friends, actually.
Oh, absolutely.
And Ed, that kind of starts your beginning of your political story. Mm-hmm. But do you remember that first week in your military life? Because I've alluded to the fact that you served in the Gunners. What was that first contact? And I think you served in the reserves before regular service. Do you remember what your early memories of military service like?
Wow, I'm having to dig deep in the memory bank here.
It wasn't that long ago.
I know. So I went to a school that had a cadet force, and at school I was a bit of an arse, really. And the teacher said, well, you can either go play rugby or you can join the cadets. And I wasn't big enough to play rugby, so I went and joined the cadets, and basically fell in love with all aspects of sort of military life, from a sense of belonging, the banter, the sense of service, and I really enjoyed that. And I sort of took everything to its logical conclusion. So as soon as I was old enough, I joined the Royal Irish Reserves, and then transferred to the Scots when I went to university, and then went regular. And yeah, I guess the abiding memory, not just of the first couple of weeks, but throughout my military career, is just that unique sense of belonging that some people in this room will have experienced, that you don't really get in any other workplace. You know, you become close with your colleagues in other walks of life, and you're sometimes very close. But I think there's the combined sort of pressures and sense of service in the military, you know, really do bond people, to the extent that Jimmy and I obviously never served together, but we have that connection. And like I mentioned, we are very close, and Jimmy's actually doing a pretty important job in my wedding. So even now, the family sort of aspect comes through. So that's what I would take away from that.
That's amazing how that's carried on through into politics. And I guess that period of your training, those characters, your directing staff in training, had a hell of a lot of operational experience, right? Were there any particular people or lessons that you learned from them during that period that have set you up, not only to go on tour, but perhaps today in life skills? Ed, go for it.
Yeah, so I had a guardsman at Sandhurst, obviously, because everyone seems to have a guardsman, colour sergeant at Sandhurst, and a gunner, a 473 chap who uniquely managed to get about half of our platoon to join the gunners from Sandhurst, which is, you know, was a big tick on his OJAR. But yeah, I mean, the example that they set and the high standards that they set is something that, you know, I think I've taken, or I've tried to take with me in politics. I consider myself quite, some people might say naive, but I would say quite idealistic. I do really have a sense of service and a sense of a calling, and of putting other people before myself. And I think when we spoke on the podcast, one of the things I mentioned is empathy, right? So in the military, because you're leading soldiers from all different backgrounds, you can't walk in everyone's shoes, but you have to be able to empathize with them if you're going to lead them effectively. And similarly in politics, I mean, if you're a member of parliament representing 100,000 people, there's no way you can have lived every one of those experiences, but the skills and sort of standards that the military sets allows you to, or certainly provided me with a great sense of empathy for my soldiers and now hopefully constituents.
Yeah, I think that does begin, that empathy begins in training, because you meet people from all sorts of walks of life as well, right? And James, what are your early memories of joining the armed forces?
Yeah, I mean, I had a very different journey into the military than Ed. I wasn't interested in the military at all, and in fact remember taking the mick out of all the people doing cadets at school. And by all the people, I mean like all 10 of them. So everyone who was in cadets will boo and hiss at me now, but I really wasn't interested. And then I left university. I'd been working in Westminster and for the Conservative Party at head office, and I had a very inspirational boss there, a guy called Michael Salter, and I mentioned to him that I was looking for a new challenge, something that I could engage in physically, something that involved leadership, that would also kind of open me up to things I really like doing, kind of coaching, managing, teaching, and I also, of course, it kind of comes back to that values issue. I was acutely aware that I had benefited massively from growing up in this country, you know, using the NHS, having a fantastic state education, which got me to where I wanted to go, and I wanted to give something back. And when you turn on the television, you see some of the scenes of, you know, British soldiers, you know, doing the very essence of what it is to support the country. I thought I want a bit of a piece of that. So I joined the reserve as a direct entry potential officer. Ironically, I joined at Handel Street, which is just up near the Brunswick Centre, and I'm actually there now 15 odd years later, teaching officer cadets from the OTC. So I've kind of come full circle. So that was, I then sort of enjoyed the reserve so much, really hated my civvy job, which I did for about 3 months outside of politics, and thought, this is what I'm going to go into, this is what I want to do, and the rest kind of is history. When you talk about, and sort of Ed's covered this really well, but people who inspired me in training, obviously your colour sergeant is very inspirational. My colour sergeant was ruthless. Like, I was scared of him. God, he was a lunatic at times. But one of the things that he really instilled in me was that you can't rely on your strengths, right? You've got your strengths, your strengths. So yes, you're good at those things, but you cannot focus on those and get better. It's your weaknesses that you need to get better at. And without Lockie, I'd be dead, no question. Some of the things that he taught me, saved my life in Afghanistan. So, and I've told him that to his face at dinner night after a few beers, and it was quite emotional for me, and it probably wasn't emotional at all for him. But it was, I think it's important to say that. I met so many people in my career who have inspired me and taught me valuable lessons, and moving that into politics, the very basis of our service, the sort of core values, if you apply them in your real life, what can go wrong? Genuinely, like, what a fantastic grounding. Simon Sinek talks about start with why. If you know, and if you know your why, you can overcome any how. That is the basis of our military family, our military experience, and I think that's an incredible message to take out into any sphere, but particularly politics.
I also like the way that you chucked up a couple of people's names there, because I think it's our responsibility throughout life, and for a thing like a podcast or events like this, where we can actually mention their names to strangers and we can reflect on that. And James, you mentioned the TV screens of Afghanistan, something that unites many of us in this room, that time of our lives, this generation, and it was played out on the TV screens through BBC's Our War, your story, that of a brother officer as well, and it was a difficult watch, if I'm honest. And as I reflect back on Afghanistan, having met you as well during pre-deployment training, to then sit down and watch that, it was a bit surreal. How must it be for you to reflect back? I mean, it's documented there forever, right, in history. Whereas for many of us, it's kind of there in our heads and photographs. But for you, James, it was front and centre on our nation's broadcast. And for those of you who haven't looked up Our War, you can find it on James's website, and the link to it. It is a fascinating piece of film. But how do you feel reflecting on that now?
Yeah, so the episode is called Return to Death Valley, so you can imagine it's not family friendly necessarily, and it was quite strange having experienced everything that happens in that documentary, filming a lot of the footage myself. There was no camera crew with us, we filmed everything, and then we gave the footage to the BBC, who then made a programme out of it. But because of some of the experiences I'd had actually through politics, I tried to give the BBC the right kind of access and the best access that they could have to make a good programme that really would capture the whole tour, and I think they did a really good job. But one of the really strange things was actually watching it with my friends, and I remember it vividly. I was at an ex-girlfriend's house, and we had a little party, and about 20 people came over, and we watched this documentary, and I really enjoyed it. I was watching all the things that happened to me and the team, and kind of laughing along with the jokes, and sort of reflecting on some of the less enjoyable parts of what happened, because there were some really tough elements, some of which were filmed, some of which weren't. And at the end, it finished, and I had expected people to say, "Wow, well done, you smashed it," or "Gosh, that was brilliant," and no one really said anything. And it put a massive dampener on the whole evening. And it wasn't, I think they were very shocked by some of the stuff that we'd gone through. And I think it's really important that a lot of people, you sort of talk to veterans and you speak to veterans, and we're all in this room and we all have different experiences. And your mate Dave, who you meet in the pub, who went to Afghanistan, you think of them one way, but when you actually see some of the things that they did, or if you allow them to really open up and tell you about some of the more unpleasant things, perhaps where they're not joking and where they're being honest, which rarely happens, in my experience, that rarely happens. People rarely open up about some of the really tough things that happened. You see people very differently. The documentary was an amazing chronicle of what happened to my soldiers and I, but it's also not something that I watch anymore. Yeah. And it must be very, very tough for some of the families of some of the soldiers who were in it and who didn't come home.
Yeah,
I think it's really important though that the public do know what their military does on their behalf. And I've obviously watched your documentary, and I'm sure we've all seen a lot of military documentaries about Afghanistan and other wars. But I think being more open about the conflicts that this country undertakes, and understanding the perspective of people on the ground that you documented and that your team documented is really important. And you should, I imagine you are proud of it, and you and your team rightly should be.
Yeah, I'd echo that sentiment. I think you should be proud of that. I think as you and I did that piece of TV as well on Afghanistan for GB News. Other outlets are available.
We get everywhere.
But I think it's a great responsibility, and I recently did a bit of living history work for the Imperial War Museum, which probably no one somebody might not hear it. Someone might press a red button in an exhibit in 30 years' time and hear my voice. I don't know. My little girl, I'd hope she'd hear it one day when she's older. But I think it's a great responsibility for us to be able to shape that in order for us to avoid conflict in the first place, quite frankly. And on reflection of both your experiences of Afghanistan and the military, do you think that as you look at this political transition from the military into the political life, how do you think that shapes decision makers from the experience of conflict? We saw the debate in Parliament during the pitting. We saw people like Tom Tugendhat being very vocal and quite emotional, Dan Jarvis on the other side, obviously Johnny Mercer, and those, I think there were about 5 Afghan veterans, including the Armed Forces Minister James Heapy, were quite outspoken at that time. I mean, how do you think the experience of conflict shapes you as you look at policy? And it might not just be defence policy, it might be more wider social policy. Do you think that shapes you, Ed, in terms of how you think about things?
Yeah, I think it gives you an acute sense of perspective on what is really important. And actually, everyone's problems are important to them, and you have to understand that. And I think, dealing with some of the issues you face on tour and in other parts of the military, you really do, get a sense that you really do get a sense of what matters, right? And what you can sort of push to one side to deal with the issue at hand. But in terms of policy making, things like that, it doesn't change my, I guess, political values. It just sort of allows me to really understand and focus on what I think on the greatest amount of impact that I can have.
Yeah, how about yourself, James?
Yeah, I think it's a really complex and a really interesting question, and we could probably talk about it for a few hours. But just as a snippet, I would say that anyone who's been through basic training has had 16 weeks of discipline and kind of that they've had the core values sort of smashed into them. Anyone who has been an officer and who's done 9 months at Sandhurst has been to arguably the world's best leadership academy in the world, and I know that there are naval and RAF equivalents, and a lot of members of Parliament haven't had training courses like that, and they haven't been exposed to values-based leadership, which we are in the military. And I think therefore that parliamentarians with military backgrounds can bring that that to the table. They also have an understanding of that kind of strategic, operational, tactical, the levels at which we want to interact, and how policy needs to address all three of those elements. But what I would say, and I think about Sir Robert Sims, MP, who I had a chat with 2.5 weeks ago, no military experience, very, very intelligent, very, very capable MP who very few people will have heard of. But the way he spoke about military operations and how he thinks about decisions to deploy or not to deploy troops, I wouldn't want to take anything away from people who don't have military backgrounds, because people like him think very, very deeply and care very, very deeply about some of the situations we get ourselves into and our policy.
Yeah, I just think perhaps there's not the time or space to debate as there was. Politics is so fast these days in Parliament. So I think just a bit more consideration to time, and we've seen some great, I think you've mentioned some great examples there of certain individuals that are a bit more considered in their approach to things like important things like deciding on warfare and whether or not to act or not. And you both sort of ended up in the same place as well, dare I say. Hopefully maybe end up in the same old building down by the River Thames maybe one day as MPs yourselves. But you both fought elections at various stages and levels. You're both on the parliamentary candidates list. But be really interested to explore why on earth you chose politics yourselves, your own personal view. So Ed, why did you choose politics?
I wanted to make a difference and serve at a national level and bring some of that values-based leadership that James has talked about to the top of our country, right? There's obviously certain issues and catalysts that led me to maybe seek that route, but generally speaking, I want to create a better society for the generations that come after me. And I think that the best way that I can do that is to serve in politics.
Awesome.
Yep. So
not to say the same thing, but
I won't. So I've always wanted to help people, and I'm not. I don't think I've got the diligence or the brain to become a doctor. I thought becoming a lawyer would be very, very boring. I have started businesses that have employed people, and I have tried to kind of get involved in society from that kind of entrepreneurial aspect. But since I was probably 16, I've really enjoyed speaking to people, and I get an absolute buzz off of helping them solve their problems or helping them achieve more than they are achieving with their lives. And I think politics is the absolute best way to do that.
And you speak to a lot of people on the doorstep, right? I mean, I've got some tales of, I probably knocked on thousands of doors across the country during my own political career of working behind the scenes of politics. I mean, but at the same time, you learn a lot. That empathy factor you were talking about, Ed, is really important. You get that from speaking to people or sitting in on a constituency surgery on a Friday of your MP, and you're taking notes for your MP, and someone walks in with the most complex, unbelievable issues, and you think, crikey, someone's got it worse off than I have. And they really have. Are there any particular moments, obviously we're not giving away any confidentiality, any moments on the campaign trail, could be quite funny things as well, light-hearted things, or those more touching things, anything that you might like to share with us from your experience of campaigning, getting out there on the doorstep, James?
Yeah, two stories. So the first one, pretty straightforward. Went to a door in Islington North, knocked on the door. The guy opened the door, and I sort of said, hello, I gave my spiel. Would you consider voting for the Conservative Party? And he said, I will vote for whoever cuts down that tree. and I said, oh, well, and he went, let me stop you. Can you cut down that tree? And I said, personally, no. I'm not a councillor, and I'm not your MP, so no. And he said, sorry then, mate, that's 4 votes. And I said, can I just ask you, are you going to vote for Labour? And he said, can they cut down this tree? And I said, well, you've got a Labour councillor who could definitely work towards that, and you've got a Labour MP who could put pressure on the council. but they're not here and they haven't cut that tree down. And he said, I've written letters to just about everyone. No one's cut that tree down. I'm not voting for any of you. You're all rubbish. And I thought to myself, fair play, he's got one criterion. I can't deliver on that. The second story, I won't go into too many details, but I was working for a member of parliament during the pandemic, and it was a bit of an all hands on deck because he was getting 300 plus emails a day from people asking very, very complex questions to rather kind of stupid time-wasting questions. And one lady who got in touch with us was managing a nursing home which had about 20 people kind of assisted living. And this was at the time where it was early on, and the supermarkets were restricting how much you could buy. And she said, we always used to go and do one big shop per week for the 20 people and the whatever it was, 5 staff, however many it was. We've just come back from our big shop with 1 4-pack of toilet roll. We can't feed these people. What are we going to do? Like, we are in serious, dire straits. I've spoken to the supermarket. They can't help us. They're following the rules. Please help. And that was where, I spoke to the MP I was working for, Gagan Mahindra. He was like, stop everything else. This is key. And by phoning the supermarket manager in a nearby supermarket, which I won't name. Well, in fact, it was Asda. It was a branch of Asda, and I spoke to a member of staff who then got the manager of the store to phone me back. Again, using the magic, I'm phoning from the local MP, and I spoke to him, and he said if she comes at 9:30 tomorrow morning, and tells me her name, I will be on shift and I will let her in and I will let her buy whatever she needs. And that worked out, and we got an email from her saying, thank you so much, I've spoken to this guy, we're going back at this time. And when people say to me, MPs are all rubbish and blah, 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 a lot of them fail at a lot of things, but they really do try generally to sort people out, and sometimes they succeed. And that was an occasion where we did succeed.
Politics matters, right? Ed, any tales you'd like to share? Cat related, maybe?
No, I have. There's context there. I have a cat, and he's a bit of a star on Twitter. But so funny one. I was out campaigning. I was a candidate in Hornsey and Wood Green, so just north of where James was in Islington, and we were campaigning outside a tube station. And a well-to-do chap walks up and says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm campaigning to be the member of parliament here." And he said, "What part are you from?" Bear in mind, I'm pretty much dressed all in blue with a blue rosette, handing out blue leaflets. And I said, "I'm from the Conservative Party." And he starts screaming and shouting at me, saying, you Tory effing and blind and all the rest of it. And it was gathering quite a crowd. And you'll remember the election was at Christmas time, and about 10 metres behind me there was chaps unloading Christmas trees from a van into a place where people could buy the Christmas trees. And They shouted over and said, "Oi, what's going on?" And I said, "Oh my God, I'm going to get it from both sides here." This is another Labour heartland, by the way, we're similar to Islington. And the chap shouts over, is like, "These Tory effing and blind and all the rest of it." And they go, he was saying, Brexit's ruined my business, the Tories have ruined my business. And they said, "Well, what was your business?" He goes, I was an architect." And they said, "Well, you must have been an effing architect then." So that was and then everything calmed down, and they went into the tube station. But the more serious one, look at the end of the election, one of the big or major sticking points about the Labour Party was the whole anti-Semitism issue that was quite strong at the time. And I was in an area of North London which has a very concentrated Jewish community, and maybe it wasn't terribly visible in other parts of the country, but knocking on doors, people were very animated about that issue. And the very last door I knocked on the 12th, was it the 11th of December or whatever it was pouring with rain all day. I was soaked through. Knew I had to get back for the count, and I knocked on this door at about 9:45, and this lady, I knew it was a Jewish family because they have a scroll attached to their door as part of their tradition. And this lady came out and I gave my usual spiel, have you voted today? Did you vote Conservative? And before she even said a couple of words, tears started falling from her eyes, and she was honestly very worried about potential for a Labour government. No matter your persuasion, that was what she honestly believed, and it really brought home to me that actually politics does matter to people, and voting in national elections matters to people. And as James was saying, MPs and governments and parties can make a difference for people's lives, and it made every single campaigning session in the cold, in the wet, in the snow, in the dark, absolutely 100% worth it, to visit someone and to at least give them some sort of hope for the future.
Thank you for sharing those stories. And I think what you also demonstrated, and you've mentioned it, James, about through training, you get this cup of resilience, and you get that from the community that you belong to in the armed forces. Very privileged position to be in. But you top up that cup of resilience in life, and then you go out there in things such as knocking on doors and getting shouted at, and that resilience, is there. It might empty out a little bit. But it's finding those places to go and top it up again, which we get from the armed forces community, and amazing evenings like this as well. So I think that's why people from the armed forces community, I believe, not only in terms of values, but in terms of skills and resilience, make good politicians. And I think the only story I can share on that front was whilst working in an MP's office, I got sent a bomb, but it was a bath bomb. And it was from an animal rights campaign, and from a celebrity, very prominent celebrity, whose name I won't mention. And he'd sent his campaign was sending out to all politicians a bath bomb, and on it said, outside it said, "contains a bomb." Great campaign. It's certainly, I think the Northamptonshire Constabulary at the time were definitely contacted by my colleague. I knew, it was obviously a bit of a joke, but that was a few years ago, but it just goes to show you that there are these ways in which campaign groups and that judgment of making what is a joke or what is an actual threat, and we've seen that played out in the press, threats to our politicians. And politicians these days, they seem to be going from one crisis to the next, don't they? Whatever it is, one crisis ends, another one begins. I mean, is crisis too strong a word to use about the political times we live in? Crisis, what crisis? Another good podcast, by the way. What do you think, James? Are we in a crisis?
I suppose everyone thinks they're always in a time of crisis. Have we been in very, very rocky political times over the last, I suppose since 2016, yes, we have. But to a certain extent, some of this crisis is actually a reaction to constitutional issues, which as a democracy, we're working out. So multiple elections in a short period of time is actually how the constitution is meant to work. If we have, a hung parliament, for example, or if we have, very divisive policies, for example, Brexit. I don't think we're in times that are more or less of a crisis now than we have previously faced, but I do think that a 24-hour news cycle and social media, this idea that every single one of us is a commentator and has some expertise and can contribute their voice, I think that has we'll start a podcast indeed. That has changed the political playing field. I don't think for the better, but I don't know how to put the genie back in the bottle.
Ed, crisis?
I think it's way overused. I think it's you mentioned 2016. You could go back to 2014 with the Scottish referendum. You could go back to 2008 with the financial crisis. You could go back to the 2001 with 9/11. You could go back to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Black Wednesday. There are periods of crisis. Let's be under no illusion. The pandemic was a crisis. The war in Ukraine was and still is a crisis. And actually, I think we sort of desensitize ourselves a little bit when we continually use this term as to what actually, it comes back to what we were talking about before about what the military gives you, and it's a sense of perspective, right? And I think sometimes, like James was saying, you can get wrapped up in your own some politicians and some parties can get wrapped up in their own sense of importance and lose sight of exactly why they're there to do the job that the public have entrusted them to do. I think some things like 24-hour media, social media hasn't obviously helped that, but it's incumbent on politicians to set that narrative, right? I often debate with James as to, should politicians follow what the people want them to do, or should they lead the people in a way in which they are entrusted to do? And I'm more so on the latter. There are certain circumstances where the former takes over, referenda and elections and things like that. But I think in recent times there's been a tendency to sort of say, well, the people want this, rather than say, well, this is my vision for the country. This is what I want to achieve, and this is how I'm going to persuade people that that's the right way to go. And you can only really do that by going back to values-based leadership, I think, because that's where people, if you employ the 6 other companies and other employers have different values and standards, but if you employ those 6 values and standards that the military has, you can't go wrong, as Jimmy said earlier. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that, and then we start to call everything a crisis, and it is overused.
Great analysis, like it. So just as we wrap up the episode, it'd be really good. I mean, you are from this generation, the Afghan generation of veterans. Younger people involved in politics is what we want to see, quite frankly. And I think you embody that, both of you. What would be your call to action to anyone from not just the military community, but those from the younger generation who might look at their politics, be a bit depressed, see it as a little bit from a certain generation, certain demographic, but what would you say to different communities that aren't perhaps as engaged, younger people, to encourage them, and you're not allowed to say don't do it, to encourage them to get involved, to stand up and serve again if they're from the military, or to get involved in public life? James, what would your succinct words of advice be?
Well, firstly, do it.
I was going to use that.
But every single person in this country should be taught that they have the potential to change the world for the better, to change their world and to change everyone around them's world by their behaviour, by their values, by their action. That's it. It's as simple as that. If you want to do that, take action, get involved.
Awesome. That could be a really small way, right? I call it the give a shit test. Give a shit about something in your community. And for those who haven't seen the Bobby Kennedy for President documentary on Netflix, that really fires you up, I tell you. All right, it's from a very privileged dynasty. But in terms of the way in which they dealt with that civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, phenomenal, inspiring stuff. That was an example of just get it done, just do it. And yourself, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, when I first met you in the pub, you didn't put it as succinctly as that. But
well, I talk a lot. So.
I know. Well, no, not at all. Well, I just have to echo what Jimmy said. You get off Twitter and get involved with your party, whatever that is. Get involved with your community. Volunteer with something. Become a school governor. Put your hat in the ring for something. And if you don't like it, you can go away and do something else. There's different types of service. If you're a businessman, I consider that a public service because you're providing jobs and opportunity for your community. But try to see things through the lens of sort of what service and what can I do to change the world around me. Because you can only change the world around you by doing things for other people. You can't, if you don't want to do that, then the world around you will just remain the same. So I would say, get involved, get stuck in.
And if from the armed forces community, stand up and serve again. James, Ed, that's been absolutely fascinating to get your insights about your journey, your background into politics. I'm sure you've inspired many people, not only in the room, but those listening to this episode as well. So on behalf of us all here, thank you very much. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, hit subscribe now. Alternatively, you can support our mission by checking out in the show notes below, where you can rate, donate, or become our mate. Thank you.